Hello there. Your imaginary friend is back with the continuation of The Nemesis of Fire by Algernon Blackwood. Now, if you haven't seen the first part, go do that. We're continuing on with part 3. At a quarter to before midnight, clad in a heavy ulster and with slippered feet, I crept cautiously from my room and stole down the passage to the top of the stairs. Outside the doctor's door, I waited a moment to listen. All was still. The house was in utter darkness, no gleam of light beneath any door. Only down the length of the corridor, from the direction of the sick room, came faint sounds of laughter and incoherent talk that were not things to reassure a mind already half a tremble, and I made haste to reach the hall and let myself out through the front door into the night. The air was keen and frosty, perfumed with night smells, and exquisitely fresh. All the million candles of the sky were alight, and a faint breeze rose and fell with faraway sighings in the tops of the pine trees. My blood leaped for a moment in the spaciousness of the night, for the splendid stars brought courage. But the next instant, as I turned the corner of the house, moving stealthily down the gravel drive, my spirits sank again, ominously. For yonder, over the funereal plumes of the 12-acre plantation, I saw the broken yellow disk of the half-moon just rising in the east, staring down like some vast being come to watch upon the progress of our doom. Seen through the distorting vapors of the earth's atmosphere, her face looked weirdly unfamiliar, her usual expression of benignant vacancy, somehow a twist. I slipped along by the shadows of the wall, keeping my eyes upon the ground. The laundry house, as already described, stood detached from the other offices, with laurel shrubberies crowding thickly behind it, and the kitchen garden so close on the other side that the strong smells of soil and growing things came across almost heavily. The shadows of the haunted plantation, hugely lengthened by the rising moon behind them, reached to the very walls and covered the stone tiles of the roof with a dark pall. So keenly were my senses alert at this moment that I believe I could fill a chapter with the endless small details of the impressions I received. Shadows, odor, shapes, sounds. In the space of a few seconds, I stood and waited before the closed wooden door. Then I became aware of someone moving towards me through the moonlight, and the figure of John Silence, without overcoat and bareheaded, came quickly and without noise to join me. His eyes, I saw at once, were wonderfully bright, and so marked was the shining pallor of his face that I could hardly tell when he passed from the moonlight into the shade. He passed without a word, beckoning me to follow, and then pushed the door open and went in. The chill air of the place met us like that of an underground vault, and the brick floor and whitewashed walls, streaked with damp and smoke, threw back the cold in our faces. Directly opposite gaped the black throat of the huge open fireplace, the ashes of wood fires still piled and scattered about the hearth, and on either side of the projecting chimney column were the deep recesses holding the big twin cauldrons for boiling clothes. Upon the lids of these cauldrons stood the two little oil lamps, shaded red, which gave all the light there was, and immediately in front of the fireplace there was a small circular table with 3 chairs set about it. Overhead, the narrow slit windows, high up in the walls, pointed to a dim network of wooden rafters, half lost among the shadows, and then came the dark vault of the roof, cheerless and unalluring for all the red light it certainly was, reminding me of some unused conventicle, bare of pews or pulpit, ugly and severe, and I was forcibly struck by the contrast between the normal uses to which the place was ordinarily put and the strange and medieval purpose which had brought us under its roof tonight. Possibly an involuntary shudder ran over me, for my companion turned with a confident look to reassure me, and he was so completely master of himself that I at once absorbed from his abundance and felt the chinks of my failing courage beginning to close up. To meet his eye in the presence of danger was like finding a mental railing that guided and supported thought along the giddy edges of alarm. "I am quite ready," I whispered, turning to listen for approaching footsteps. He nodded, still keeping his eyes on mine. Our whispers sounded hollow as they echoed overhead among the rafters. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "Not all would have the courage. Keep your thoughts controlled and imagine the protective shell round you, round your inner being." "I'm all right," I repeated, cursing my chattering teeth. He took my hand and shook it, and the contact seemed to shake into me something of his supreme confidence. The eyes and hands of a strong man can touch the soul. I think he guessed my thought, for a passing smile flashed about the corners of his mouth. "You will feel more comfortable," he said in a low tone, "when the chain is complete. The colonel we can count on, of course. Remember, though," he added warningly, "he may perhaps become controlled, possessed, when the thing comes, because he won't know how to resist. And to explain the business to such a man." He shrugged his shoulders expressively. "But it will only be temporary, and I will see that no harm comes to him." He glanced round at the arrangements with approval. "Red light," he said, indicating the shaded lamps, "has the lowest rate of vibration. Materializations are dissipated by strong light, won't form or hold together in rapid vibrations." I was not sure that I approved altogether of this dim light, for in complete darkness there is something protective, the knowledge that one cannot be seen, probably, which a half-light destroys. But I remembered the warning to keep my thoughts steady, and forbore to give them expression. There was a step outside, and the figure of Colonel Ragus stood in the doorway. Though entering on tiptoe, he made considerable noise and clatter, for his free movements were impeded by the burden he carried, and we saw a large yellowish bowl held out at arm's length from his body, his mouth, the mouth covered with a white cloth. His face, I noted, was rigidly composed. He too was master of himself, and as I thought of this old soldier moving through the long series of alarms, worn with watching and wearied with assault, unenlightened yet undismayed, even down to the dreadful shock of his sister's terror, and still showing the dogged pluck that persists in the face of defeat, I understood what Dr. Silence meant when he described him as a man to be counted on. I think there was nothing beyond this rigidity of his stern features and a certain grayness of the complexion to betray the turmoil, the emotions that were doubtless going on within, and the quality of these two men, each in his own way, so keyed me up that by the time the door was shut and we had exchanged silent greetings, all the latent courage I possessed was well to the fore, and I felt as sure of myself as I knew I ever could feel. Colonel Ragus set the bowl carefully in the center of the table. "Midnight," he said shortly, glancing at his watch, and we all three moved to our chairs. There, in the middle of that cold and silent place, we sat, with the vile bowl before us, and a thin, hardly perceptible steam rising through the damp air from the surface of the white cloth and disappearing upwards the moment it passed beyond the zone of red light and entered the deep shadows thrown forward by the projecting wall of chimney. The doctor had indicated our respective places, and I found myself seated with my back to the door and opposite the black hearth. The colonel was on my left and Dr. Silence on my right, both half facing me, the latter more in shadow than the former. We thus divided the little table into even sections, and sitting back in our chairs, we awaited events in silence. For something like an hour, I do not think there was even the faintest sound within those four walls, and under the canopy of that vaulted roof. Our slippers made no scratching on the gritty floor, and our breathing was suppressed almost to nothing. Even the rustle of our clothes, as we shifted from time to time upon our seats, was inaudible. Silence smothered us absolutely, the silence of night, of listening, the silence of a haunted expectancy. The very gurgling of the lamps was too soft to be heard, and if light itself had sound, I do not think we should have noticed the silvery tread of the moonlight as it entered the high narrow windows and threw upon the floor the slender traces of its pallid footsteps. Colonel Raga and the doctor, and myself too, for that matter, sat thus like figures of stone, without speech and without gesture. My eyes passed in ceaseless journeys from the bowl to their faces, and from their faces to the bowl. They might have been masks, however, for all the signs of life they gave, and the light steaming from the horrid contents beneath the white cloth had long ceased to be visible. Then presently, as the moon rose higher, the wind rose with it. It sighed like the lightest of passing wings over the roof. It crept most softly round the walls, made the brick floor like ice beneath our feet. With it I saw mentally the desolate moorland flowing like a sea about the old house, the treeless expanse of lonely hills, the nearer copses, sombre and mysterious in the night. The plantation, too, in particular, I saw, and imagined I heard the mournful whisperings that must now be a stirring amongst the tree tops as the breeze played down between the twisted stems. In the depth of the room behind us, the shafts of moonlight met and crossed in a growing network. It was after an hour of this wearing and unbroken attention, and I should judge about 1 o'clock in the morning, when the baying of the dogs in the stable yard first began. And I saw John Silence move suddenly in his chair and sit up in an attitude of attention. Every force in my being instantly leaped into the keenest vigilance. Colonel Raga moved too, though slowly, and without raising his eyes from the table before him. The doctor stretched his arm out and took the white cloth from the bowl. It was perhaps imagination that persuaded me. The red glare of the lamps grew fainter, and the air over the table before us thickened. I'd been expecting something for so long. The movement of my companions and the lifting of the cloth may easily have caused the momentary delusion that something hovered in the air before my face, touching the skin of my cheek with a silken run. But it was certainly not a delusion that the colonel looked up at the same moment and glanced over his shoulder, as though his eyes followed the movements of something to and fro about the room, and that he then buttoned his overcoat more tightly about him, and his eyes sought my own face first and then the doctor's. And it was no delusion that his face seemed somehow to have turned dark, become spread, as it were, with a shadowy blackness. I saw his lips tighten, and his expression grow hard and stern, and it came to me then with a rush that, of course, this man had told us but a part of the experiences he'd been through in the house, and that there was much more he had never been able to bring himself to reveal at all. I felt sure of it. The way he turned and stared about him betrayed a familiarity with other things than those he had described to us. It was not merely a sight of fire he looked for. It was a sight of something alive, intelligent, something able to evade his searching. It was a person. It was the watch for the ancient being who sought to obsess him. And the way in which Dr. Silence answered his look, though it was only by a glance of subtlest sympathy, confirmed my impression. "We may be ready now," I heard him say in a whisper, and I understood that his words were intended as a steadying warning, and braced myself mentally to the utmost of my power. Yet, long before Colonel Raga had turned to stare about the room, and long before the doctor had confirmed my impression that things were at last beginning to stir, I had become aware, in most singular fashion, that the place held more than our 3 selves. With the rising of the wind, this increase to our numbers had first taken place. The baying of the hounds almost seemed to have signaled it. I cannot say how it may be possible to realize that an empty place has suddenly become not empty, when the new arrival is nothing that appeals to any of the senses. For this recognition of an invisible, as of the change in the balance of personal forces in a human group, is indefinable, beyond proof, yet it is unmistakable, and I knew perfectly well at what given moment the atmosphere within these four walls became charged with the presence of other living beings besides ourselves. And on reflection, I'm convinced that both my companions knew it too. "Watch the light," said the doctor under his breath. And then I knew, too, that it was no fancy of my own that had turned the air darker, and the way he turned to examine the face of our host sent an electric thrill of wonder and expectancy shivering along every nerve in my body. That it was no kind of terror that I experienced, but rather a sort of mental dizziness, and a sensation as of being suspended in some remote and dreadful altitude where things might happen, indeed were about to happen, that had never before happened within the ken of man. Horror may have formed an ingredient, but it was not chiefly horror, and in no sense ghostly horror. Uncommon thoughts kept beating on my brain like tiny hammers, soft yet persistent, seeking admission. Their unbidden tide began to wash along the far fringes of my mind, the currents of unwanted sensations to rise over the remote frontiers of my consciousness. I was aware of thoughts and the fantasies of thoughts that I never knew before existed. Portions of my being stirred that had never been stirred before, and things ancient and inexplicable rose to the surface and beckoned me to follow. I felt as though I were about to fly off at some immense tangent into an outer space hitherto unknown even in dreams. And so singular was the result produced upon me that I was uncommonly glad to anchor my mind as well as my eyes upon the masterful personality of the doctor at my side. For there, I realized, I could draw always upon the forces of sanity and safety. With a vigorous effort of will, I returned to the scene before me and tried to focus my attention with steadier thoughts upon the table and upon the silent figures seated round it, and then I saw that certain changes had come about in the place where we sat. The patches of moonlight on the floor, I noted, had become curiously shaded. The faces of my companions opposite were not so clearly visible as before, and the forehead and cheeks of Colonel Raga were glistening with perspiration. I realized further that an extraordinary change had come about in the temperature of the atmosphere. The increased warmth had a painful effect not alone on Colonel Raga, but upon all of us. It was oppressive and unnatural. We gasped figuratively as well as actually. "You are the first to feel it," said Dr. Silence in low tones, looking across at him. "You are in most intimate touch, of course." The colonel was trembling and appeared to be in considerable distress. His knees shook so that the shuffling of his slippered feet became audible. He inclined his head to show that he had heard, but made no other reply. I think even then he was sore put to it to keep himself in hand. I knew what he was struggling against. As Dr. Silence had warned me, he was about to be obsessed, and was savagely, though vainly, resisting. But meanwhile, a curious and whirling sense of exhilaration began to come over me. The increasing heat was delightful, bringing a sensation of intense activity, of thoughts pouring through the mind at high speed, of vivid pictures in the brain, of fierce desires and lightning energies alive in every part of the body. I was conscious of no physical distress such as the colonel felt, but only of a vague feeling that it might all grow suddenly too intense, that I might be consumed, that my personality as well as my body might become resolved into the flame of pure spirit. I began to live at a speed too intense to last. It was as if 1,000 ecstasies besieged me. "Steady," whispered the voice of John Silence in my ear, and I looked up with a start to see that the colonel had risen from his chair. The doctor rose too. I followed suit, and for the first time saw down into the bowl. To my amazement and horror, I saw that the contents were troubled. The blood was astir with movement. The rest of the experiment was witnessed by us standing. It came, too, with a curious suddenness. There was no more dreaming, for me at any rate. I shall never forget the figure of Colonel Raga standing there beside me, upright and unshaken, squarely planted on his feet, looking about him, puzzled beyond belief, yet full of a fighting anger. Framed by the white walls, the red glow of the lamps upon his streaming cheeks, his eyes glowing against the deathly pallor of his skin, breathing hard and making convulsive efforts of hands and body to keep himself under control, his whole being roused to the point of savage fighting, yet with nothing visible to get at anywhere. He stood there, immovable against odds. And the strange contrast to the pale skin and the burning face I had never seen before, nor wished to see again. But what has left an even sharper impression on my memory was the blackness that then began crawling over his face, obliterating the features, concealing their human outline, and hiding him inch by inch from view. This was my first realization that the process of materialization was at work. His visage became shrouded. I moved from one side to the other to keep him in view, and it was only then I understood that, properly speaking, the blackness was not upon the countenance of Colonel Raga, but that something had inserted itself between me and him, thus screening his face with the effect of a dark veil. Something that apparently rose through the floor was passing slowly into the air above the table and above the bowl. The blood in the bowl, moreover, was considerably less than before. And with this change in the air before us, there came at the same time a further change, I thought, in the face of the soldier. One half was turned towards the red lamps, while the other caught the pale illumination of the moonlight, falling aslant from the high windows, so that it was difficult to estimate this change with accuracy of detail. But it seemed to me that, while the features, eyes, nose, mouth, remained the same, the life informing them had undergone some profound transformation. The signature of a new power had crept into the face and left its traces there, an expression dark and in some unexplained way terrible. Then suddenly he opened his mouth and spoke, and the sound of this changed voice, deep and musical though it was, made me cold and set my heart beating with uncomfortable rapidity. The being, as he had dreaded, was already in control of his brain, using his mouth. "I see a blackness like the blackness of Egypt before my face," said the tones of this unknown voice that seemed half his own and half another's. "And out of this darkness they come. I gave a dreadful start. The doctor turned to look at me for an instant, and then turned to center his attention upon the figure of our host, and I understood in some intuitive fashion that he was there to watch over the strangest contest man ever saw, to watch over, and if necessary, to protect. "He is being controlled, possessed," he whispered to me through the shadow. His face wore a wonderful expression, half triumph, half admiration. Even as Colonel Raga spoke, it seemed to me that this visible darkness began to increase, pouring up thickly out of the ground by the hearth, rising up in sheets and veils, shrouding our eyes and faces. It stole up from below, an awful blackness that seemed to drink in all the radiations of light in the building, leaving nothing but the ghost of a radiance in their place. Then out of this rising sea of shadows issued a pale and spectral light that gradually spread itself about us, and from the heart of this light I saw the shapes of fire crowd and gather, and these were not human shapes, or the shapes of anything I recognized as alive in the world, but outlines of fire that traced globes, triangles, crosses, and the luminous bodies of various geometrical figures. They grew bright, faded, then grew bright again, with an effect almost of pulsation. They passed swiftly to and fro through the air, rising and falling, and particularly in the immediate neighborhood of the colonel, often gathering about his head and shoulders, and even appearing to settle upon him like giant insects of flame. They were accompanied, moreover, by a faint sound of hissing, the same sound we had heard that afternoon in the plantation. "The fire elementals that precede their master," the doctor said in an undertone. "Be ready." And while this weird display of the shapes of fire alternately flashed and faded, and the hissing echoed faintly among the dim rafters overhead. We heard the awful voice issue at intervals from the lips of the afflicted soldier. It was a voice of power, splendid in some way I cannot describe, and with a certain sense of majesty in its cadences. As I listened to it with quickly beating heart, I could fancy it was some ancient voice of time itself, echoing down immense corridors of stone, from the depths of vast temples, from the very heart of mountain tombs. "I have seen my divine father Osiris," thundered the great tones. "I have scattered the gloom of the night. I have burst through the earth, and am one with the starry deities." Something grand came into the soldier's face. He was staring fixedly before him, as though seeing nothing. "Watch," whispered Dr. Silence in my ear, and his whisper seemed to come from very far away. Again the mouth opened, and the awesome voice issued forth. "Thoth," it boomed, "has loosened the bandages of Set, which fettered my mouth. I have taken my place in the great winds of heaven." I heard the little wind of night with its mournful voice of ages sighing round the walls and over the roof. "Listen," came from the doctor at my side, and the thunder of the voice continued. "I have hidden myself with you, O ye stars that never diminish. I remember my name in the house of fire." The voice ceased, and the sound died away. Something about the face and figure of Colonel Raga relaxed, I thought. The terrible look passed from his face. The being that obsessed him was gone. "The great ritual," said Dr. Silence, aside to me, very low. "The Book of the Dead. Now it's leaving him. Soon the blood will fashion it a body." Colonel Raga, who had stood absolutely motionless all this time, suddenly swayed so that I thought he was going to fall, and but for the quick support of the doctor's arm, he probably would have fallen, for he staggered, as in the beginning of collapse. "I'm drunk with the wine of Osiris," he cried, and it was half with his own voice this time. "But Horus, the eternal watcher, is about my path for safety." The voice dwindled and failed, dying away into something almost like a cry of distress. "Now, watch closely," said Dr. Silence, speaking loud, "for after the cry will come the fire." I began to tremble involuntarily. An awful change had come without warning into the air. My legs grew weak as paper beneath my weight, and I had to support myself by leaning on the table. Colonel Raga, I saw, was also leaning forward with a kind of droop. The shapes of fire had vanished all, but his face was lit by the red lamps, and the pale shifting moonlight rose behind him like mist. We were both gazing at the bowl, now almost empty. The colonel stooped so low I feared every minute he would lose his balance and drop into it. And the shadow that had so long been in the process of forming now at length began to assume material outline in the air before us. Then John Silence moved forward quickly. He took his place between us and the shadow. Erect, formidable, absolute master of the situation, I saw him stand there, his face calm and almost smiling, and fire in his eyes. His protective influence was astounding and incalculable. Even the abhorrent dread I felt at the sight of the creature growing into life and substance before us lessened in some way, so that I was able to keep my eyes fixed on the air above the bowl without too vivid a terror. But as it took shape, rising out of nothing, as it were, and growing momentarily more defined in outline, a period of utter and wonderful silence settled down upon the building and all it contained, a hush of ages, like the sudden center of peace at the heart of a traveling cyclone, descended through the night, and out of this hush, as out of the emanations of the steaming blood, issued the form of the ancient being who had first sent the elemental of fire upon its mission. It grew and darkened and solidified before our eyes. It rose from just beyond the table so that the lower portions remained invisible, but I saw the outline limn itself upon the air, as though slowly revealed by the rising of a curtain. It apparently had not then quite concentrated to the normal proportions, but was spread out on all sides into space, huge though rapidly condensing, for I saw the colossal shoulders, the neck, the lower portion of the dark jaws, the terrible mouth, and then the teeth and lips, and as the veil seemed to lift further upon the tremendous face, I saw the nose and cheekbones. In another moment, I should have looked straight into the eyes, but what Dr. Silence did at that moment was so unexpected and took me so by surprise that I've never yet properly understood its nature, and he has never yet seen fit to explain in detail to me. He uttered some sound that had a note of command in it, and in so doing stepped forward and intervened between me and the face. The figure just nearing completeness, he therefore hid from my sight. I've always thought purposely hid from my sight. "The fire!" he cried out. "The fire! Beware!" There was a sudden roar as of flame from the very mouth of the pit, and for the space of a single second all grew light as day. A blinding flash passed across my face, and there was heat for an instant that seemed to shrivel skin and flesh and bone. Then came steps, and I heard Colonel Raga utter a great cry, wilder than any human cry I'd ever known. The heat sucked all the breath out of my lungs with a rush, and the blaze of light as it vanished swept my vision with it into enveloping darkness. When I recovered the use of my senses, a few moments later, I saw that Colonel Raga, with a face of death, its whiteness strangely stained, had moved closer to me. Dr. Silence stood beside him, an expression of triumph and success in his eyes. The next minute, the soldier tried to clutch me with his hand. Then he reeled, staggered, and, unable to save himself, fell with a great crash upon the brick floor. After the sheet of flame, the wind raged round the building as though it would lift the roof off, but then passed as suddenly as it came. And in the intense calm that followed, I saw that the form had vanished. Then the doctor was stooping over Colonel Raga upon the floor, trying to lift him to a sitting position. "Light," he said quietly. "More light. Take the shades off." Colonel Raga sat up, and the glare of the unshaded lamps fell upon his face. It was grey and drawn, still running heat, and there was a look in the eye and about the corners of the mouth that seemed in this short space of time to have added years to its age. At the same time, the expression of effort and anxiety had left it. It showed relief. "Gone," he said, looking up at the doctor in a dazed fashion and struggling to his feet. "Thank God it's gone at last." He stared round the laundry as though to find out where he was. "Did it control me? Did it take possession of me? Did I talk nonsense?" he asked bluntly. "After the heat came, I remember nothing." "You'll feel yourself again in a few minutes," the doctor said. To my infinite horror, I saw that he was surreptitiously wiping sundry dark stains from the face. "Our experiment has been a success," and he gave me a swift glance to hide the bowl standing between me and our host while I hurriedly stuffed it down under the lid of the nearest cauldron. "And none of us the worse for it," he finished. "And fires?" he asked, still dazed. "There'll be no more fires?" "'Tis dissipated. Partly, at any rate," replied Dr. Silence cautiously. "And the man behind the gun," he went on, only half realizing what he was saying, I think. "Have you discovered that?" "A form materialized," said the doctor briefly. "I know for certain now what the directing intelligence was behind it all." Colonel Raga pulled himself together and got upon his feet. The words conveyed no clear meaning to him yet, but his memory was returning gradually, and he was trying to piece together the fragments into a connected whole. He shivered a little, for the place had grown suddenly chilly. The air was empty again, lifeless. "You feel all right again now?" Dr. Silence said, in the tone of a man stating a fact, rather than asking a question. Thanks to you both. Yes. He drew a deep breath and mopped his face and even attempted a smile. It made me think of a man coming from the battlefield with the stains of fighting still upon him, but scornful of his wounds. Then he turned gravely towards the doctor with a question in his eyes. Memory had returned, and he was himself again. Precisely what I expected, the doctor said calmly. A fire elemental sent upon its mission in the days of Thebes, centuries before Christ, and tonight, for the first time in all these thousands of years, released from the spell that originally bound it. He stared at him in amazement, Colonel Raga opening his lips for words that refused to shape themselves. And if we dig, he continued significantly, pointing to the floor where the blackness had poured up, we shall find some underground connection, a tunnel most likely, leading to the 12-acre wood. It was made by your predecessor. A tunnel made by my brother, gasped the soldier. Then my sister should know. She lived here with him. He stopped suddenly. John Silence inclined his head slowly. I think so, he said quietly. Your brother, no doubt, was as much tormented as you have been. He continued after a pause in which Colonel Raga seemed deeply preoccupied with his thoughts. And tried to find peace by burying it in the wood, and surrounding the wood then, like a large magic circle with the enchantments of the old formulae. So the stars the man saw blazing. But burying what? Asked the soldier faintly, stepping backwards towards the support of the wall. Dr. Silence regarded us both intently for a moment before he replied. I think he weighed in his mind whether to tell us now or when the investigation was absolutely complete. The mummy, he said softly after a moment. The mummy that your brother took from its resting place of centuries and brought home here. Colonel Raga dropped down upon the nearest chair, hanging breathlessly on every word. He was far too amazed for speech. The mummy of some important person, a priest most likely, protected from disturbance and desecration by the ceremonial magic of the time, for they understood how to attach to the mummy, to lock up with it in the tomb, an elemental force that would direct itself, even after ages, upon anyone who dared to molest it. In this case, it was an elemental of fire. Dr. Silence crossed the floor and turned out the lamps one by one. He had nothing more to say for the moment. Following his example, I folded the table together and took up the chairs, and our host, still dazed and silent, mechanically obeyed him and moved to the door. We removed all traces of the experiment, taking the empty bowl back to the house, concealed beneath an ulster. The air was cool and fragrant as we walked to the house, the stars beginning to fade overhead, and a fresh wind of early morning blowing up out of the east where the sky was already hinting of the coming day. It was after 5 o'clock. Stealthily, we entered the front hall and locked the door, and as we went on tiptoe upstairs to our rooms, the colonel, peering at us over his candle as he nodded good night, whispered that if we were ready, the digging should be begun that very day. Then I saw him steal along to his sister's room and disappear. Part 4. But not even the mysterious references to the mummy, or the prospect of a revelation by digging, were able to hinder the reaction that followed the intense excitement of the past 12 hours, when I slept the sleep of the dead, dreamless and undisturbed. A touch on the shoulder woke me, and I saw Dr. Silence standing beside the bed, dressed to go out. Come, he said. It's tea time. You've slept the best part of a dozen hours. I sprang up, and made a hurried toilette while my companion sat and talked. He looked fresh and rested, and his manner was even quieter than usual. Colonel Raga has provided spades and pickaxes. We're going out to unearth this mummy at once, he said, and there's no reason we should not get away by the morning train. I'm ready to go tonight, if you are, I said honestly, but Dr. Silence shook his head. I must see this through to the end, he said gravely, and in a tone that made me think he still anticipated serious things, perhaps. He went on talking while I dressed. This case is really typical of all stories of mummy haunting, and none of them are cases to trifle with, he explained. For the mummies of important people, kings, priests, magicians, were laid away with profoundly significant ceremonial and were very effectively protected, as you've seen, against desecration and especially against destruction. The general belief, he went on, anticipating my questions, held, of course, that the perpetuity of the mummy guaranteed that of its ka, the owner's spirit. But it is not improbable that the magical embalming was also used to retard reincarnation, the preservation of the body preventing the return of the spirit to the toil and discipline of earth life. And in any case, they knew how to attach powerful guardian forces to keep off trespassers. And anyone who dared to remove the mummy, or especially to unwind it, well, he added with meaning, you have seen, and you will see. I caught his face in the mirror while I struggled with my collar. It was deeply serious. There could be no question that he spoke of what he believed and knew. The traveller brother who brought it here must have been haunted too, he continued, for he tried to banish it by burial in the wood, making a magic circle to enclose it, something of genuine ceremonial he must have known, for the stars the man saw were, of course, the remains of the still flaming pentagrams he traced at intervals in the circle. Well, he did not know enough, or perhaps possibly was ignorant that the mummy's guardian was a fire force. Fire cannot be enclosed by fire, though, as you saw, it can be released by it. Then that awful figure in the laundry, I asked, thrilled to find him so communicative. Undoubtedly, the actual ka of the mummy, operating always behind its agent, the elemental, and most likely thousands of years old. And Miss Ragged, I ventured once more. Ah, Miss Ragged, he repeated with increased gravity. Miss Ragged. A knock at the door brought a servant with word that tea was ready, and the colonel had sent to ask if we were coming down. The thread was broken. Dr. Silence moved to the door and signed to me to follow, but his manner told me that in any case no real answer would have been forthcoming to my question. And the place to dig in? I asked, unable to restrain my curiosity. Will you find it by some process of divination, or... He paused at the door and looked back at me, and with that he left me to finish my dressing. It was growing dark when the three of us silently made our way to the 12-acre plantation. The sky was overcast, and a black wind came out of the east. Gloom hung about the old house, and the air seemed full of sighings. We found the tools ready laid at the edge of the wood, and each shouldering his piece, we followed our leader at once in among the trees. He went straight forward for some 20 yards, and then stopped. At his feet lay the blackened circle of one of the burned places. It was just discernible against the surrounding white grass. There are 3 of these, he said, and they all lie in a line with one another. Any one of them will tap the tunnel that connects the laundry, the former museum, with the chamber where the mummy now lies buried. He at once cleared away the burnt grass and began to dig. We all began to dig. While I used the pick, the others shoveled vigorously. No one spoke. Colonel Raga worked the hardest of the 3. The soil was light and sandy, and there were only a few snake-like roots and occasional loose stones to delay us. The pick made short work of these. And meanwhile, the darkness settled about us, and the biting wind swept roaring through the trees overhead. And then quite suddenly, without a cry, Colonel Raga disappeared up to his neck. The tunnel, cried the doctor, helping to drag him out, red, breathless, and covered with sand and perspiration. Now, let me lead the way. And he slipped down nimbly into the hole, so that a moment later we heard his voice, muffled by sand and distance, rising up to us. Hubbard, you come next, and then Colonel Raga, if he wishes, we heard. I'll follow you, of course, he said, looking at me as I scrambled in. The hole was bigger now, and I got down on all fours in a channel not much bigger than a large sewer pipe, and found myself in total darkness. A minute later, a heavy thud, followed by a cataract of loose sand, announced the arrival of the colonel. Catch hold of my heel, called Dr. Silence, and Colonel Raga can take yours. In this slow, laborious fashion, we wormed our way along a tunnel that had been roughly dug out of the shifting sand and was shored up clumsily by means of wooden pillars and posts. Any moment, it seemed to me, we might be buried alive. We could not see an inch before our eyes, but had to grope our way, feeling the pillars and the walls. It was difficult to breathe, and the colonel behind me made but slow progress, for the cramped position of our bodies was very severe. We had travelled in this way for 10 minutes, and gone perhaps as much as 10 yards, when I lost my grasp of the doctor's heel. "Ah!" I heard his voice, sounding above me somewhere. He was standing up, in a clear space, and the next moment I was standing beside him. Colonel Raga came heavily after, and he too rose up and stood. Then Dr. Silence produced his candles, and we heard preparations for striking matches. Yet even before there was light, an indefinable sensation of awe came over us all. In this hole in the sand, some 3 feet underground, we stood side by side, cramped and huddled, struck suddenly with an overwhelming apprehension of something ancient, something formidable, something incalculably wonderful, that touched in each one of us a sense of the sublime and the terrible, even before we could see, an inch before our faces. I know not how to express in language this singular emotion that caught us here in utter darkness, touching no sense directly, it seemed, yet with the recognition that before us in the blackness of this underground night there lay something that was mighty, the mightiness of long past ages. I felt Colonel Raga press in closely to my side, and I understood the pressure and welcomed it. No human touch, to me at least, has ever been more eloquent. Then the match flared, 1,000 shadows fled on black wings, and I saw John Silence fumbling with the candle, his face lit up grotesquely by the flickering light below it. I dreaded this light. Yet when it came, there was apparently nothing to explain the profound sensations of dread that preceded it. We stood in a small vaulted chamber in the sand, the sides and roof shored with bars of wood, and the ground laid roughly with what seemed to be tiles. It was 6 feet high, so that we could all stand comfortably, and may have been 10 feet long by 8 feet wide. Upon the wooden pillars at the side, I saw that Egyptian hieroglyphics had been rudely traced by burning. Dr. Silence lit 3 candles and handed one to each of us. He placed a 4th in the sand against the wall on his right, and another to mark the entrance to the tunnel. We stood and stared about us, instinctively holding our breath. "Empty, by God!" exclaimed Colonel Raga. His voice trembled with excitement, and then as his eyes rested on the ground, he added, "And footsteps! Look! Footsteps in the sand!" Dr. Silence said nothing. He stooped down and began to make a search of the chamber, and as he moved, my eyes followed his crouching figure and noted the queer distorted shadows that poured over the walls and ceiling after him. Here and there thin trickles of loose sand ran fizzing down the sides, the atmosphere, heavily charged with faint yet pungent odors, lay utterly still, and the flames of the candles might have been painted on the air for all the movement they betrayed. And as I watched, it was almost necessary to persuade myself forcibly that I was only standing upright with difficulty in this little sand-hole of a modern garden in the south of England, for it seemed to me that I stood as in vision at the entrance of some vast rock-hewn temple, far, far down the river of time. The illusion was powerful and persisted. Granite columns that rose to heaven piled themselves about me, majestically uprearing, and a roof like the sky itself spread above a line of colossal figures that moved in shadowy procession along endless and stupendous aisles. This huge and splendid fantasy, born I knew not whence, possessed me so vividly that I was actually obliged to concentrate my attention upon the small stooping figure of the doctor as he groped about the walls, in order to keep the eye of the imagination on the scene before me. But the limited space rendered a long search out of the question. His footsteps, instead of shuffling through loose sand, presently struck something of a different quality that gave forth a hollow and resounding echo. He stooped to examine more closely. He was standing exactly in the center of the little chamber when this happened, and he at once began scraping away the sand with his feet. In less than a minute, a smooth surface became visible, the surface of a wooden covering. The next thing I saw was that he had raised it and was peering down into a space below. Instantly, a strong odor of niter and bitumen, mingled with a strange perfume of unknown and powdered aromatics, rose up from the uncovered space and filled the vault, stinging the throat and making the eyes water and smart. "The mummy," whispered Dr. Silence, looking up into our faces over his candle, and as he said the word, I felt the soldier lurch against me and heard his breathing in my very ear. "The mummy," he repeated under his breath as we pressed forward to look. It's difficult to say exactly why the sight should have stirred in me so prodigious an emotion of wonder and veneration, for I have not had a little to do with mummies, have unwound scores of them, and even experimented magically with not a few. But there was something in the sight of that grey and silent figure, lying in its modern box of lead and wood at the bottom of this sandy grave, swathed in the bandages of centuries, and wrapped in the perfumed linen that the priests of Egypt had prayed over with their mighty enchantments thousands of years before. Something in the sight of it, lying there and breathing its own spice-laden atmosphere, even in the darkness of its exile in this remote land. Something that pierced to the very core of my being, and touched that root of awe which slumbers in every man near the birth of tears and the passion of true worship. I remember turning quickly from the colonel, lest he should see my emotion, yet fail to understand its cause, turn and clutch John Silence by the arm, and then fall trembling to see that he too had lowered his head and was hiding his face in his hands. A kind of whirling storm came over me, rising out of I know not what utter deeps of memory, and in a whiteness of vision I heard the magical old chauntings from the Book of the Dead, and saw the gods pass by in dim procession, the mighty immemorial beings who were yet themselves only the personified attributes of the true gods, the god with the eyes of fire, the god with the face of smoke. I saw again Anubis, the dog-faced deity, and the children of Horus, the eternal watcher of the ages, as they swathed Osiris, the first mummy of the world, in the scented and mystic bands. And I tasted again something of the ecstasy of the justified soul as it embarked in the golden boat of Ra and journeyed onwards to rest in the fields of the blessed. And then, as Dr. Silence with infinite reverence stooped and touched the still face, so dreadfully staring with its painted eyes, there rose again to our nostrils wave upon wave of this perfume of thousands of years, and time fled backwards like a thing of naught, showing me in haunted panorama the most wonderful dream of the whole world. A gentle hissing became audible in the air, and the doctor moved quickly backwards. It came close to our faces, and then seemed to play about the walls and ceiling. "The last of the fire, still waiting for its full accomplishment," he muttered, but I heard both words and hissing as things far away, for I was still busy with the journey of the soul through the 7 halls of death, listening for echoes of the grandest ritual ever known to men. The earthen plates, covered with hieroglyphics, still lay beside the mummy, and round it, carefully arranged at the points of the compass, stood the 4 jars, with the heads of the hawk, the jackal, the cynocephalus, and man, the jars in which were placed the hair, the nail parings, the heart, and other special portions of the body. Even the amulets, the mirror, the blue clay statues of the Ka, and the lamp with 7 wicks were there. Only this sacred scarabaeus was missing. "Not only has it been torn from its ancient resting place," I heard Dr. Silence saying in a solemn voice as he looked at Colonel Rago with fixed gaze, "but it has been partially unwound." He pointed to the wrappings of the breast. "And the scarabaeus has been removed from the throat." The hissing, it was like the hissing of an invisible flame, had ceased. Only from time to time we heard it as though it passed backwards and forwards in the tunnel, and we stood looking into each other's faces without speaking. Presently Colonel Raga made a great effort and braced himself. I heard the sound catch in his throat before the words actually became audible. "My sister," he said very low, and then there followed a long pause, broken at length by John's silence. "It must be replaced," he said significantly. "I know nothing," the soldier said, forcing himself to speak the words he hated saying. "Absolutely nothing." "It must be returned," repeated the other. "If it is not now, too late, for I fear... Colonel Raga made a movement of assent with his head. "It shall be," he said. The place was still as the grave. I do not know what it was then that made us all three turn round with so sudden a start, for there was no sound audible, to my ears at least. The doctor was on the point of replacing the lid over the mummy when he straightened up as if he'd been shot. "There's something coming," said Colonel Raga under his breath, and the doctor's eyes, peering down the small opening of the tunnel, showed me the true direction. A distant shuffling noise became distinctly audible, coming from a point about halfway down the tunnel we had so laboriously penetrated. "It's the sand falling in," I said, though I knew it was foolish. "No," said the colonel calmly, in a voice that seemed to have the ring of iron. "I've heard it for some time past. It is something alive, and it is coming nearer." He stared about him with a look of resolution that made his face almost noble. The horror in his heart was overmastering, yet he stood there, prepared for anything that might come. "There's no other way out," John Silence said. He leaned the lid against the sand and waited. I knew by the mask-like expression of his face, the pallor and the steadiness of the eyes, that he anticipated something that might be very terrible, appalling. The colonel and myself stood on either side of the opening. I still held my candle and was ashamed of the way it shook, dripping the grease all over me. But the soldier had set his into the sand just behind his feet. Thoughts of being buried alive, being smothered like rats in a trap, of being caught and done to death by some invisible and merciless force we could not grapple with, rushed into my mind. Then I thought of fire, suffocation, of being roasted alive. The perspiration began to pour from my face. "Steady," came the voice of Dr. Silence to me through the vault. For 5 minutes that seemed 50, we stood waiting, looking from each other's faces to the mummy and from the mummy to the hole. And all the time the shuffling sound, soft and stealthy, came gradually nearer. The tension, for me at least, was very near the breaking point when at last the cause of the disturbance reached the edge. It was hidden for a moment just behind the broken rim of soil. A jet of sand, shaken by the close vibration, trickled down onto the ground. I've never in my life seen anything fall with such laborious leisure. The next second, uttering a cry of curious quality, it came into view, and it was far more distressingly horrible than anything I had anticipated. For the sight of some Egyptian monster, some god of the tombs, or even of some demon of fire, I think I was already half prepared. But when instead I saw the white visage of Miss Raga, framed in that round opening of sand, followed by her body crawling on all fours, her eyes bulging and reflecting the yellow glare of the candles, my first instinct was to turn and run like a frightened, frantic animal seeking a way of escape. But Dr. Silence, who seemed no whit surprised, caught my arm and steadied me, and we both saw the colonel then drop upon his knees and come thus to a level with his sister. For more than a whole minute, as though struck in stone, the two faces gazed silently at each other. Hers, for all the dreadful emotion in it, more like a gargoyle than anything human, and his, white and blank with an expression that was beyond either astonishment or alarm. She looked up, he looked down. It was a picture in a nightmare. and the candle stuck in the sand close to the hole threw upon it the glare of impromptu footlights. Then John Silence moved forward and spoke, in a voice that was very low, yet perfectly calm and natural. "I am glad that you have come," he said. "You are the one person whose presence at this moment is most required, and I hope that you may yet be in time to appease the anger of the fire and to bring peace again to your household, and," he added lower still so that no one heard it but myself, "safety to yourself." And while her brother stumbled backwards, crushing a candle into the sand in his awkwardness, the old lady crawled farther into the vaulted chamber and slowly rose upon her feet. At the sight of the wrapped figure of the mummy, I was fully prepared to see her scream and faint, but on the contrary, to my complete amazement, she merely bowed her head and dropped quietly upon her knees. Then, after a pause of more than a minute, she raised her eyes to the roof, and her lips began to mutter, as in prayer. Her right hand, meanwhile, which had been fumbling for some time at her throat, suddenly came away, and before the gaze of all of us she held it out, palm upwards, over the grey and ancient figure outstretched below, and in it we beheld glistening the green jasper of the stolen scarabaeus. Her brother, leaning heavily against the wall behind, uttered a sound that was half cry, half exclamation. But John Silence, standing directly in front of her, merely fixed his eyes on her and pointed downwards to the staring face below. "Replace it," he said sternly, "where it belongs." Miss Raga was kneeling at the feet of the mummy when this happened, and we three men all had our eyes riveted on what followed. Only the reader who, by some remote chance, may have witnessed a line of mummies, freshly laid from their tombs upon the sand, slowly stir and bend as the heat of the Egyptian sun warms their ancient bodies into the semblance of life, can form any conception of the ultimate horror we experienced when the silent figure before us moved in its grave of lead and sand. Slowly before our eyes it writhed, and with a faint rustling of the immemorial cerements rose up, and through sightless and bandaged eyes stared across the yellow candlelight at the woman who had violated it. I tried to move. Her brother tried to move, but the sand seemed to hold our feet. I tried to cry. Her brother tried to cry, but the sand seemed to fill our lungs and throat. We could only stare. And even so, the sand seemed to rise like a desert storm and cloud our vision. And when I managed at length to open my eyes again, the mummy was lying once more upon its back, motionless, a shrunken and painted face upturned towards the ceiling. And the old lady tumbled forward and was lying in the semblance of death, with her head and arms upon its crumbling body. But upon the wrappings of the throat I saw the green jasper, the sacred scarabaeus, shining again like a living eye. Colonel Raga and the doctor recovered themselves long before I did, and I found myself helping them clumsily and unintelligently to raise the frail body of the old lady, while John Silence carefully replaced the covering over the grave and scraped back the sand with his foot, while he issued brief directions. I heard his voice as in a dream, but the journey back along that cramped tunnel, weighted by a dead woman, blinded with sand, suffocated with heat, was in no sense a dream. It took us the best part of half an hour to reach the open air, and even then we had to wait a considerable time for the appearance of Dr. Silence. We carried her undiscovered into the house and up to her own room. "The mummy will cause no further disturbance," I heard Dr. Silence say to our host later that evening as we prepared to drive for the night train. "Provided always," he added significantly, "that you and yours cause it no disturbance." It was in a dream, too, that we left. "You did not see her face, I know," he said to me as we wrapped our rugs about us in the empty compartment, and when I shook my head, quite unable to explain the instinct that had come to me not to look, he turned toward me, his face pale and genuinely sad. "Scorched and blasted," he whispered.